and a wonderful day ahead of us. For those who don't know, my name is Anthony. Welcome to those in the building. Welcome to those who are joining us at home. Just a word or two about today. Everybody is very welcome. We have a loo back through there. We'll have various breaks during the session, but this indeed is a day to ponder the joy of Irish poetry. And I was thinking, preparing for this morning, of the slightly typical thing. Isn't it amazing that such a small place like Ireland has produced so many great literary figures over the years? But then I think that's probably true of many small places, and I got myself a little bit carried away. But as we may know, Monday is St. Patrick's Day, and so it seems especially fitting today. It's to do what we're doing today. It is a great joy to welcome Matt Campbell, Professor Matt Campbell, today, among, as well as knowing everything there is to know about Irish poetry, no pressure there. He also knows a huge amount about 19th century English poetry. Our first quiz question today is, at the time, who was the best-selling poet in England, best-selling English poet in the 19th century? And it's not Tennyson.
Edward Fitzgerald.
Now, all my quiz questions are based slightly on urban myth. So I'm not going for him. There is a college in Oxford named after him. Keble. John Keble. Because his Christian year, everybody felt they should have a copy of the Christian year at home. And so it sold enormously. And so if ever we sing a John Keble hymn, New Every Morning is the Love, etc., that comes from that book. Anyway, he's probably no longer the best-selling 19th century poet, it must be said. But we're going to hear about some great ones today. Matt Campbell, expert on lots of poetry things. Do please look up the books that he's read, books he's written. What was the large one you mentioned?
The most recent one is a big collection of essays, which is the Oxford Handbook of W.B. Yeats, published a couple of years ago. There's 40 essays in there, 44 essays in there, by various people from all over the world, from Kyoto to Georgia. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Oxford Handbook of W.B. Yeats. So we heard that advertised here. And do please look it up, everybody. It is St. Patrick's Day on Monday, and one of those people who had such influence on the spirituality of these islands and elsewhere. And I wondered if I might start with his famous prayer. I bind unto myself today the strong name of the Trinity, by invocation of the same, the three in one and one in three. I bind this day to me forever, by power of faith, Christ's incarnation, his baptism in the Jordan River, his death on cross for my salvation, his bursting from the spiced tomb, his riding up the heavenly way, his coming at the day of doom. I bind unto myself today. Almighty God, we do pray for your blessing on all our thinking and learning this day. Amen. Amen. Without further ado, I shall hand over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Anthony. The reason why I said Edward Fitzgerald is because the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam was one of the best-selling poems of the 19th century. But I know now that I'm being recorded, I'm going to get the figures wrong, but William Wordsworth only sold something like 500 copies of his poems in his lifetime. So it's the popularity is the interesting thing, no matter how.
Which makes some of us feel a lot better.
Yes. Okay. Anyway, hello everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Ben, for inviting me, and for Anthony as well for hosting this. It's nice to see you, and hopefully over the next few hours we get to know each other, and we have nice conversations as well. I have a couple of pieces which were kind of written as part of my recent research. But by the afternoon it'll be a bit more workshopy, because you'll see there's I'm going to say contemporary poems, but poems published in the last 30 or 40 years by Heaney and Heaney Cullinan, and that might give us an opportunity to workshop those poems as well as to read them. I very much hope that I will be able to stop talking every half an hour or so, and then we can have a break, we have a real conversation to see what you think about things. And I also very much hope that that you can see that we're kind of roughly where I'm going here today. Because it's called Faith and Heresy, and there's probably more heresy than faith, although you could be a heretic and have faith, I suppose. So the question of belief is here. Where I'll begin is with the beliefs of, or what were the beliefs of William Butler Yeats, because he was, as I will come on to say, a man of many and heterodox opinions and beliefs. And there'll be a couple of poems that we look at closely in order to think about that. The second session will be about Austin Clarke, who was born and raised a Catholic, but I'm going to tell a story of Catholicism and apostasy all the way through the middle of the 20th century. And before I come up to the kind of what I might call, or what some critics call, the secular mysticism of contemporary poets, and those would be Seamus Heaney and the great Irish woman poet Elaine Cullinan, who among the poets that I'm speaking about, she's the only one who is still with us. But this being Oxford, I think I have to start with Walter Pater. And if you look at the first extract on your little collection of things, I'm just going to read out this little thing that Seamus Heaney wrote, published in 1974. What Heaney was doing was reviewing the poems of Ossip Mandelstam. It's the first paragraph of that review. And Mandelstam, you will remember, wrote a supposedly satirical poem, Couplet a Squid, against Stalin, was arrested and then spent the rest of his life in the Gulag. So if we think about the figure of Mandelstam, we think about the figure of the heroism of the integrity of the poet, and he viewed him as that, but he also viewed him as the integrity and the heroism of poetry itself. So what you're going to get here is the first of these kind of heretical statements is that there is a faith in poetry, and poetry itself is faith. Now I'll read the extract. Art for art's sake, that's Walter Pater, has become a jibe because of an inadequate notion of what art can encompass, and is usually bandied by people who are Philistines anyhow. Art has a binding force for the artist. Language is the poet's faith and the faith of his fathers. And in order to go his own way and his proper work in an agnostic time, he has to bring that faith to the point of arrogance and triumphalism. Poetry may indeed be a lost cause, like Jacobitism, as a young Scottish poet observed recently. But each poet must raise his voice like a pretender's flag. Whether the world falls into the hands of the security forces or the fat-necked speculators, he must get in under the phalanx of words and start resisting. This was the young Seamus Heaney, in quite fierce form, unusually for him. What he's thinking about here, if he's talking about the security forces, well, this is something written in 1974, so it was written at the beginning of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and he's talking about the fat-necked speculators. Well, there's something else going on there, which we may or may not get to later on, about what was going to happen in the whole kind of mid-century dispensation, social and political as well. Okay, so this is our art for art's sake and the faith of poetry. So I'll leave that hanging there, and we'll go back to this later. Now I want to ask a question, and this is going to begin to focus in on William Butler Yeats. And the question is, what did Irish poets believe? What did Irish poems believe? Now that's a nonsense question, because of course poems don't believe anything. Poets or readers might believe things. But when Irish poets wrote about God, or gods, or the soul, the resulting poems were as likely to be esoteric as orthodox. The secularism of many of their European or American contemporaries was an exception. The conversions or the reconversions of poets like T.S. Eliot or W.H. Auden were quite rare in Irish poetry, but as I say, apostasy was rife. Irish poems after independence and partition, and that is after the Treaty of 1921, and that's roughly where I'll be. I'll be speaking about the Irish poetry whenever you get these two polities in Ireland after 1921. The state that was to become the Republic of Ireland and the state which is connected to the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland. These Irish poems after independence and partition were written in two largely confessional polities, divided according to sect and long hatred. By the end of the 20th century, the island seemed to be refighting the wars of the Reformation. So Ireland's history in the time of world cultures, often called modernist, looks like a throwback in the context of what Seamus Heaney called the huge collapse that has taken place at the centre of that Christian thing. Heaney was writing to Ted Hughes in 1996 after attending Mass in Santiago de Compostela. And he added, though, in the letter to Hughes, that the memory of belief presented itself as a sort of mourning for what he had lost. The whole underlife of my childhood and teens rallied and wept for itself, he said. Now, if we are not suspicious of the word Western in relation to contemporary convictions, then its alternatives in Islamic or Zen Buddhist belief or practice also sounded a constant strain in mid-century Irish writing, not to mention the sorts of magic practiced by various theosophists or spiritualists. Many places in the world are most definitely not post-Christian. For instance, much of North and South America. And many places of the world too evince the weight of the word fundamentalist. Though we may still tend to think of Ireland as a predominantly Christian place, the beliefs of its predominant writers, William Butler Yeats or James Joyce or Seamus Heaney, were by terms heretical, openly rebellious, or even just nostalgic in the face of contending orthodoxies, invoking locations like Byzantium or Ithaca, along with Tara or Tirnanog. The shapes, the sounds, and even the smells of religion are an aesthetic experience much plundered by poets and dramatists. The liturgy, the dramas of rite or ritual, be they Christian or arcane, are never far from the ways in which words find form in poems. The extravagances of some beliefs provide elaborate ways of doing meaning in poetry, transmuted into symbol, parable, mythology, the exploration of selfhood, or in ethics in the private and the public realm. The word confessional describes a poetic genre, but it is also the place in which the sacrament now known as reconciliation or penance occurs, not to mention a term used to describe the role of established religion in the confessional state. And given the role of churches in the two polities of Ireland, those churches remain intrinsic to matters of politics and governance. To this day, in the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, one is a country where for 500 years the head of the Church of England has also been the head of state. And in the other, this is Ireland, a statement specifying the, and I quote, special position of the Holy Catholic Apostolic and Roman Church as the guardian of the faith, professed by the great majority of the citizens. That statement was only removed from the state's first constitution in 1972. So the Catholic Church was enshrined constitutionally in the Constitution of Ireland, as indeed the head of state is also the head of the church in the United Kingdom. Austin Clarke thought he lived in a new penal age. And by the late 1960s into his own 70s, he thought he had discovered eternal absolution in the example of Jonathan Swift or the Greek Gaelic poet Brian Merriman. This was partly historical, but it's predominantly a matter of the growing liberalisation of Western societies and Ireland's inevitable catching up with that liberalism or that liberalisation. It's also a matter of poetry or for poetry, in which its freedoms of thought might lead to freedom from certain kinds of sin. As Seamus Heaney wrote in 1978 in an essay called The Poet as a Christian, and this is on your handout as well, the poetic vocation involves a pursuit of psychic health, a self-possession, an adjustment between outer and inner realities, a religious commitment to the ever-evolving disciplines of the art, which the poet has to credit as his form of sanctity. So you can see I'm moving around between established beliefs, orthodox beliefs and heterodox beliefs, and between the mystical and the secular, and moving the mystical into the secular realm and bringing the secular back into the mystical again too, and thinking about how these ideas can work. And at the center of it, there's the idea that the poem itself is a central place in which you can explore an ethical set of questions about how one lives one's life in the world, but also another set of questions about how one might live its life with other worlds as well too, be they Christian or arcane or pagan or whatever it is, and I'll be moving around various ideas to do with this here. Okay. So this section in my ongoing work I've called Yeats and the Angels, but we'll see how we go with this too. But I want to go back to T.S. Eliot, and T.S. Eliot is the great kind of strong Christian voice in 20th century English poetry and in English criticism and social criticism, and the fact that he really could not stand Yeats's beliefs. Because the theological oddness in the work of W.B. Yeats stands at the head of this poetic as much as spiritual question. His oddness stretches back to his spiritualist practices and inquiries in the 1890s. But by the 1920s, with the help from some extra-worldly communicators, it has developed into its own system of world history. And I don't know whether you know the story that Yeats got married to an English woman called Georgie Hyde Leeds in 1917, a marriage which he seemed immediately to regret, and she was having difficulties in it. But part of the reason why he married her was, one, because his astrological chart told him this was the time to get married, and two, there was a girl who was available who was also a spiritualist. And on their honeymoon, in Stone Cottage, where's Stone Cottage? Anyway, somewhere in South England. No, not Stone Cottage. It was in a hotel, on their honeymoon. She said, let's have a seance. And through her left hand writing backwards, communicators from the spirits dictated to him a complete system of world history, which he subsequently published in 1925 as his vision, a vision. And that is a complete system, but dictated through Georgie, so it's her system which he then wrote up, if you can follow me. And Georgie had the reading in 19th century philosophy and Hegel and what have you, which enabled her to put together this world system. And it's an incredibly complicated system of gars and masks and all kinds of things, and we really don't have time to go into that today, but we can do in the questions if you've got another 3 or 4 hours. But what this gave to Yeats is another one of these versions of world history that you were getting in the interwar years between 1918 and 1939, and Yeats died in 1939. But the question any reader of Yeats has to ask themselves is, do you have to believe it? Because it's a system which is so heterodox and so arcane, and seems to be the knowledge of, Madame Blavatsky's tarot cards or whatever it is. Do you really have to believe that, or do you have to, or not? But how much do you need to know about this in order to get to the central drama which is going on in the poems themselves? And it is always a dramatic, and by that I mean it's something that's worked out always as a dialogue, or what Yeats called antinomies. And antinomies are parallel lines which only meet in infinity. And if you think of the mathematical sign for infinity, it is of 2 lines crossing over. Yes, now infinity is a place, but we've never been there, I don't think. Rather like eternity, which may be a place, but none of us have yet to be there. So there's something going on in these kinds of things here. So, Yeats's beliefs are much removed from the convictions or the experiences of the most devout believers in the world's main religions. In his 1934 lectures, After Strange Gods, glossing the Cambridge critics Richard's critique of Yeats's private belief system, Richard said it was a symbolic phantasmagoria. Dissociated states are insufficiently connected with normal experience. Eliot had this to say about the heresy of a contemporary he respected, but he could never quite believe. And this is on your handout. Mr. Yeats' supernatural world was the wrong supernatural world. It is not a world of spiritual significance, not a world of real good and evil, a holiness or sin, but a highly sophisticated lower mythology, summoned like a physician to supply the fading impulse of poetry with some transient stimulant so that the dying patient may utter his last words. So this is one of the great put-downs of one great writer, one great Nobel Prize winner for another. But Yeats's lower mythology is a matter for the survival of poetry as much as for its avowed supernatural world. And Eliot just about allows himself to countenance the idea of Yeats's occultism, but his deliberate Christian illiberalism, that's Eliot and After Strange Gods, is an attack on the liberalism of the church in the 1930s. He cannot resist a dig at that occultism as palliative and ministrant of the last rites. Madame Sosostris in Eliot's The Wasteland with her wicked pack of cards, I don't know whether you know Madame Sosostris, but she's a thinly veiled character. That character is a thinly veiled caricature of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society, whose meetings Yeats had attended since the late 1880s, from his 20s. Whatever their conflicting views of the tarot, neither poet was in any way a political liberal, as we understand the term, although in the theological sense, Yeats's syncretism, in other words, a belief in many different systems all brought together, his syncretism was a long way from Eliot's eventual Anglo-Catholic orthodoxy. As the politically illiberal 1930s continued, both poets found different solutions to its threats to culture and to faith, with poetry foremost among the victims needing the last rites, as Eliot said. Eliot, and to a lesser extent, Yeats were conservatives in the mode of Edmund Burke. And like many Burkean conservatives, they blamed liberalism for the new totalitarian states. Eliot said liberalism can prepare the way for that which is its own negation, the artificial, mechanized, or brutalized control, which is a desperate remedy for its chaos. I think we're going through similar times as we speak. Eliot's own newly Christian poems and criticism increasingly reported on dramas of faith and doubt as a riposte to a contemporary liberal culture, which was diagnosed as the ground from which the great heresies of fascism or communism had sprung. Yeats's esoteric theology also vacillated, and that word vacillation we return to later, between belief and skepticism, or better, soul and self. For all that the visionary and later political writings dallied with the unitary solution offered by strong versions of authority, they could not let the drama be quelled by state religion, or worse, totalitarianism. The Yeatsian mode is dialogue, not monologue, but nevertheless, like Eliot, he too aligned himself with an illiberal, undemocratic hierarchy, in his case a recreation of the Irish ascendancy class of Edmund Burke. All hated Whiggery. Yeats wrote, but what is Whiggery? A levelling, rancorous, rational sort of mind that never looked out of the eye of a saint or out of a drunkard's eye. And the drama of mind here is between the rational and the saintly, a tolerance which is unable to countenance even the transient joy of the Augustinian drunk. And you may remember St. Augustine, who saw the drunk on the side of the road, and that was his model of the saintly man, because he was happy and unconcerned with any of the normal desires of life. Get back to Augustinianism in a minute, or later today. For both writers, there was little meaningful distinction to be made between the political and the religious. As Eliot sought to defend or define the idea of a Christian society, for Yeats, the goal of unity of being also involved unity of culture. And the theology of these poets was grounded in theories of history as incarnate, by turns Christian, classical, Celtic, or founded in what the poet Austin Clarke, which I'll talk about later, would call secret beliefs. By incarnate, I mean, in the words of the opening of the Gospel of John, the Word was made flesh and blood among us. The birds of Yeats's poems about the moment of incarnation, Leda and the Swan, or the Mother of God, are harbingers of the divine made flesh, And in the story of Leda, the goddess Zeus takes the form of a swan in order to impregnate Leda, and she gives birth to Helen, and then that's the destruction of an entire civilization. And in the Mother of God, which is the story of the Virgin Mary, of course, the dove appears, the Holy Spirit appears in the figure of the dove, as it does through many Western pictures, or Western, in the Western iconography of the Annunciation. So if the bringing together of word and flesh is not restricted to the Christian version of the idea, the word is, of course, the means by which poetry approaches its own form as art, though it could never be that of the word of God itself. Almond heresy, all persuasions agree. So, I'm going to talk about sin now, and we started working our way around this idea of sin, and how this is worked through as a kind of set of ethical questions related to the idea of incarnation. Okay? And there's two big, quite difficult poems, which we'll get onto very soon. For Yeats, sin is original. That is, definition of the word original, belonging to the beginning or the earliest stage of something, existing at or from the earliest in time. In the Christian story, redemption from original sin requires divine intervention in the form of the incarnation and the sacrifice of Christ. For Eliot, original sin in the abstract is the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which in the age of prudence can never retract. For Yeats, it is in an anti-redemptive version of it. It is the god commits the sin in the rip of Leda and its consequences, the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Homer gives way to Aeschylus. Epic gives way to tragedy, the unforeseen consequences of original sin. In Vacillation, which is the poem we're looking at later, faced with the transcendental directions offered by soul, look on that fire, salvation walks within. Heart answers with a typical Yeatsian rhyming question, what theme had Homer but original sin? And the various incarnations in Yeats's poems are led through this argumentative mode in which mystical knowledge is always questioned. Sin and redemption are an endlessly recurrent balance, as in the Magi, poem about the birth of Christ, where the pale, or rather about the visit of the Magi of the Epiphany, where the pale unsatisfied ones are by Calvary's turbulence unsatisfied. These Magi must seek once more the vision of incarnation in a stable in Bethlehem, the uncontrollable mystery on the bestial floor. Wonderful last line of poem, Yeats' poem, Magi, the uncontrollable mystery on the bestial floor. But they are unsatisfied by Calvary in the poem. Calvary has happened before Bethlehem. The ending of the story has preceded its beginning, and the whole thing spins round in an endlessly recurring and endlessly repeating mystical circle. Are you with me? Okay. Given this, and here's another word for you, purgatorial garring, is a vision of purgatory, and both Eliot and Yeats deeply interested in the idea of purgatory. This is a garring around ends and beginnings, with seemingly no redemption or hint of the paradisal. Eliot objected to the end of Yeats's play Purgatory, his last play that he published before his death in 1939. It's a ghost play in which the crime of breeding across class and sect is not absolved by the further crime of murdering the progeny of the breeding. Eliot called it a play in which there is no hint, or at least no emphasis upon purgation. In the Yeatsian version of the eugenics of history, the sins of the fathers remain to propagate themselves in endless repetitions of a remorse which multiplies at the very moment it is willed away, in the words of the poem. This isn't on your handout, but this is this famous line from the poem called Remorse for Intemperate Speech. Out of Ireland have we come. Great hatred, little room, maimed us at the start. I carry from my mother's womb a fanatic heart. it circles round this idea of liberal speech, the idea of hatred, and then hatred becomes the fanatic heart. And the literary critic Terence Brown, who lectured taught me way back in the 1980s, back in Trinity College in Dublin, Terence says about, in his biography of Yeats, says about these lines, fanaticism is a physical condition in Ireland, nurtured in the womb of the nation. Can it really be judged, since extremism is a condition of birth and fate? Is that a paraphrase, or is that the Irishman's despairing aside, when are we going to be delivered from this endless fanaticism? So, the fanatic heart comes round a number of times, and I'm going to skip over a little bit here, so we need to get into some Yeats poems. Far too much TSLA going on here. And I'm going to talk about the balance of innocence and experience in this kind of drama of sin and redemption, which works its way through these heterodox poems. The balance of innocence and experience as pleasure and misery runs through Yeats's weighing of the soul in his poetry. The quote from the rejected title of his gift of Harun al-Rashid, which is a parabolic poem about the mystical, his own mystical marriage. It's set in the desert. It is set in a place, and it was initially called desert geometry. There's some kind of place which is somewhere near close to the beginnings of all civilization, somewhere in Palestine or in Arabia or Egypt. There was some kind of mythological originary point, but of course the originary point, as we've been talking about, is also the origin of the sin. Whether that be eaten or not, that's another issue. It is a revelation from the desert, Bethlehem, the second coming, the birth of a nation, or the birth of civilization, or whatever it might be called. It is conceived in the very longest run and over millennia. It brings all sorts of faith to bear on the actions of human beings, or fallen human beings, I should say, whose only crime is the crime of being born. And in the opening pages of the 1937 version of A Vision, the book I told you about, the geometry of engineering or such actions is weighed up as such, and it's not on your handout list, but I'll read it to you anyway. What of Christ and Oedipus? Or to shift the names, St. Catherine of Genoa and Michelangelo are the two scales of a balance, the two butt ends of the seesaw. What if every 2,000 and odd years something happens in the world to make one sacred, the other secular, one wise, the other foolish, one fair, the other foul, one divine, the other devilish? What if there is an arithmetic or geometry that can exactly measure the slope of a balance, the dip of a scale, and so dip the coming of that something? Now the second pivot of the balance or the seesaw of this arithmetic of geometry after Christ and Oedipus is around 1500 in Yeats's historical system. St. Catherine and Michelangelo were contemporaries, albeit offering differing versions of the afterlife. In her case, prefaced by a long purgatory, the long purgatory which is life on earth in her mystical writings. In his, both his creation and his last judgment, which are eventually brought together in the same place. The balance of the seesaw offers contraries, as explored in A Vision, as it goes on creating a phantasmagorical system of its incarnate world systems, gyres spinning with frequent violence into each other. If he had sought to measure those opposing forces in his mystical or his occult writing, his poems frequently added rhetorical counter-pressures that function outside or against that attempt at measurement. The writing of his verse sustains, suspends, or prolongs that sense of spiritual struggle into the slope of balance. It's not a impersonally weighed dialectic in the Hegelian system, which he's roughly adopting, or Georgie Hadley's is roughly adopting, or indeed the other version of the dialectic, which is a material dialectic, which is the Marxist system, which again was having its moment very strongly in the 1930s as well too. That's not what it's doing. It's as I said here, it's a slope of a balance, the dip of a scale. Things are coming in and out of this kind of balance. And Vacillation, the poem is on your handout, and this is how it begins. It's a statement of opposites. Between extremities, man runs his course. A brand or flaming breath comes to destroy all those antinomies of day and night. The body calls it death, the heart remorse. Which seems fine, but he always got a question to come after the end of this. But what if these be right? What is joy? Yeats's poems and plays are populated by discriminating, mistaking, hating, and sometimes loving people. Mostly caught in the contingencies of the historical moment of their own present day. His system is small consolation when faced with the unbalancings of the self, caught between extremities and unresolvable antinomies, no matter how they might be explained away by the crime of being born into great hatred, little room. If Eliot complained about Yeats's play Purgatory as a play with no purgation, so the drama of a life of mistakes, of something which now and again is labelled crime or sin, remains sustained in the purgatorial present of the actuality of the poems as they develop and counter-develop their idealism. The mystical achievement of St. Catherine offers a sort of Augustinian perfection of the soul on earth. But the closer the poet contemplates that perfection, the further he shrinks away from it. Even perfection involves a choice. As in the poem, The Choice, which begins, the intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work. Choosing the latter, poverty ensues. But even then, in other words, if you choose work, poverty ensues. But even then, when all that story's finished, what's the news? News is the quotidian, the everyday, the accident and the incoherence which upsets all the perfection of your work. News is the other, opposite, contingent, one butt end of the seesaw of poetry and life. Now this drama is worked through these two long poems which you've got here, A Dialogue of Self and Soul and Vacillation, collected together in the Winding Stair volume, which is a great volume of 1929. I'm going to say 1929, not being recorded. Let's go for 1929, maybe 1932. Both poems waver over an unspecified yet absolved crime, or at least from what is given by the text themselves. This is something, he's done something wrong. Now these crimes, these texts are suspended, unresolved purgatorial poems, exhibiting by turns the mastery of the ottava rimer, which you'll see in the in Dialogue of Self and Soul, these great eight-line stanzas, or the roughened, slightly more roughened version of Vacillation. Hamlet haunts both of them. A character experienced by Yeats through the thoughts of the sanctity of Shakespeare. And the quote from Yeats on Hamlet is at the beginning of your handout. I feel in Hamlet, as so often in Shakespeare, that I am in the presence of a soul lingering on the storm-beaten threshold of sanctity. Has not that threshold always been terrible, even crime-haunted? Surely Shakespeare in those last seeming idle years of his, Shakespeare after his retirement, was no quiet country gentleman, enjoying as men like Dowden think. Dowden was the professor of English, one of the first professors of English in the world, in Trinity College in Dublin, enjoying as men like Dowden think the temporal reward of an undervalued toil. Perhaps he sought for wisdom in itself at last, and not in its passionate shadows. Maybe he had passed the threshold, and nonetheless for Johnson's drinking bout. Certainly one finds here and there in his work praise of country leisure sweetened by wisdom. But the word wisdom is now used as something that Shakespeare sought, and it's tempered into a kind of folky country lore. Yeats printed these thoughts from 1999 in a piece called The Death of Synge, which was about his friend Synge. And his friend Synge, he thought, was just like Shakespeare. He was, with him, self-assertion of any kind was impossible. The external self, the mask, the persona was a shadow. Character was all. And his friend John Remington Synge, the playwright, and William Shakespeare, the playwright, were the same kind of person, impersonal, standing aside and apart from the thing that they're doing. James Joyce has the picture of Stephen Dedalus, rather the character Stephen Dedalus in James Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man, has the figure of the poet of standing aside, completely indifferent, paring his fingernails. But in a dialogue of self and soul, my soul offers deliverance from the crime of death and birth in thoughts of ancestral night, if but imagination scorn the earth. The dialogue of self and soul is set in Tourbalili. I don't know whether anybody's ever been or been to see it, which was a former Norman fort. It was built in the 15th century to protect its colonizing inmates from a rebellious population. And Yeats bought this, and with his wife they converted it into a holiday home. It's currently a museum when it's open, because it's right beside a beautiful location, right beside the stream. But like most rivers these days, it floods on an annual basis, so it's mostly closed rather than open. But anyway, the winding stair, which is inside the tower, is the winding stair of this movement up towards the heavens. And that leads to the battlements of this northern tower. But it also sends Gar-like to glimpses of the divine at the top. And pointing to an antique Japanese weapon in the poem, Sato's sword, which was a gift, somebody had given me this gift of this sword, myself says it cannot throw off the beautiful objects of the earth. So there's an image of permanence, this Japanese sword, which has been fashioned in such a way that it's a permanent art object. And it's sitting there in its beauty. But Yeats cannot trade in that object that's on the earth, because there are also invisible presences around here. And all the way through, Yeats, and this is his heretical position, the self retains the right to sin. The self-dramatization, a man in his 60s, as he was when he wrote the poem, wielding a 500-year-old sword in a poorly converted summer home, is faintly absurd. But don't worry, the precious possession is merely to employ as an emblem. It's merely a symbol. And this is in the poem. And all these I set for emblems of the day against the tower, emblematical of the night, and claim as by a soldier's right a charter to commit the crime once more. Only the dead can be forgiven, my soul says of heaven. In doing so, it realizes it cannot speak from that place, heaven that is, but when I think of that, my tongue's a stone. The poem is then given over to myself in the second half, and the determination that when the life just lived will inevitably recur, and his mistakes will happen again, he will inevitably forgive himself again. And this is, I'm going to read the last couple of stanzas here. I am content. I am content to live it all again, and yet again, if it be life to pitch into the frog spawn of a blind man's ditch, a blind man battering blind men. Or into that most fecund ditch of all the folly that man does, or must suffer, if he woos a proud woman, not kindred of his soul. I am content to follow to its source every event, in action or in thought, measure the lot, forgive myself the lot. When such as I cast out remorse, so great a sweetness flows into the breast, we must laugh and we must sing. We are blessed by everything. Everything we look upon is blessed. Extraordinary, wonderful lines, and I trust I don't offend your beliefs. But there's a certain sense of the self-authentication or the self-styled priestliness, indeed, of the person administering absolution to himself. Has he thought the whole thing out in silence? Now, these stanzas are certainly a construction or an imitation of thinking through something. Although they need to be spoken, that is to be heard, and I've just read them out. The rhymes, and this is the Ottava rhyme, the great great stanza form here, of the eight-line stanza. The rhymes veer off between the slightly off, again, men, dolls, woos, if you can hear them there, and they're semantically fastened together. And by that I mean is when the rhyme comes, it actually changes the meaning of the word that was first used. Pitch into the ditch, source of my remorse.
expressed is blessed. So something going on there to do to make sure whenever the rhymes come, they're reinforcing the thought. The syntax weighs heavily into its balancing pauses, beautiful things. I love measure the lot, semicolon, forgive the lot. And the measurement of the lot might be a hangover from the desert geometry. And on the other hand, it might be a suppression of the wriggling of the ethically unformed, the frog spawn of a blind man's ditch. And of that extraordinary image of the frog spawn, the great American critic who unfortunately died last year, Helen Vendor, said, the sexual frog spawn and the biblical blind battering, shall they not both fall into the ditch? Are the utmost reduction of love and war, abased even beyond the lust and the rage, and lust and rage of a poem from 1936, the spur, the fury, rage and mire of human beings. Now the reference to the shall they not both fall into the ditch is to the Gospel of Luke, and the blind leading the blind. Except here the blind have been fighting each other. There's no small success in Yeats' sudden, willful self-forgiveness that the poem succeeds to shift the seesaw so successfully towards its ending. This seeming impasse and its expiation are then followed by the great sparsely punctuated roll of joy at the poem's ending. Self-invocation of the manifold. We are blessed by everything, and everything we look upon is blessed. The world itself is the object of both of our blessing and of the blessed. Now, can a moment like this atone for these sins or crimes? He hasn't mentioned what the crimes or the sins are. So what has he absolved himself of? He simply swerved away from them in a moment of joy, in other words, an ecstatic transcendental moment, a spiritual mystical experience. Is that it? As with his romantic precursors, or indeed his avant-garde contemporaries and successors, such moments are hedged around with contingency and accident. In other words, the stuff that happens around us. What Seamus Heaney, a favourite quote of Seamus Heaney's, not his, but of Seamus Heaney's, the music of what happens. Surprised by joy, indeed, if you think about Wordsworth. And is that what it is? That joy is always a surprise. And if you know that Wordsworth poem, by the way, it's the most beautiful poem where he's surprised by joy, and it seems like a wonderful thing until he realizes, oh no, I've just lost something, I'm supposed to be grieving. And so as soon as he's got the experience of joy, it's immediately followed by guilt. In the middle of vacillation, if we look into vacillation again, let me see if I can get a copy of this, because in the middle of vacillation, there is the ecstatic moment. It's section 4, or the visionary moment, or the mystical moment. My 50th year had come and gone. I sat, a solitary man, in a crowded London shop, an open book and empty cup on the marble top. While on the shop and street I gazed, my body of a sudden blazed, and 20 minutes more or less, it seemed so great my happiness that I was blessed and could bless. Now, of that moment, the poet Allen Ginsberg, American poet Allen Ginsberg, said in a conversation with a fellow poet, Philip Wong, this is what Ginsberg said, I love that marble top. You really got it right there. It's like classic. I'm sorry, I can't do Ginsberg accent. I don't think anyone's done better in recording a moment of exaltation at a marble top. From such banality, transcendent experience comes. But it's time limited. Yeats adds the specifics. And 20 minutes, more or less, it seems. How long did your moment of exaltation last? About 20 minutes. To 20 minutes of exaltation, Yeats adds a fantasy of priesthood dispensing blessings. It is to Yeats' credit that such moments court their own skeptical commentary called in the moment of bathos, or an awareness of high-minded self-characterization. There's a poem, this wonderful poem called High Talk, which is about this little parable poem about speaking too highly about things. Generically, this is a comic process, I think. I hope I find it funny, and I can't argue that. If you buy the Oxford Handbook of Yeats, you will find an essay by me, a chapter by me, on the subject of Yeats as a comedian. But it is also one that takes these experiences so seriously that it countenances their opposite just as it puts them forward. The marble-topped cafe table in the London cafe, the frog spawn, all serve to remind us of every day and its evolving formlessness, lust and rage remain. Now, I think I'm going to move along. I have a little thing here about poet Geoffrey Hill, but I'll just move slightly past what Hill, who was a fan of Yeats, is in many ways. But I'll just think about, I might go back to Hill in a minute, but I think I need to go back to Original Sin, because we're about half an hour in, and maybe it's time to pause in a second. So, the heart in vacillation silenced the soul, and with the question, what theme had Homer but Original Sin? And this ends the 7th section of the poem, but the familiar questions in the 5th section remain unforgiven. Responsibility so weighs me down. Things said or done long years ago, or things I did not do or say, but thought that I might say or do. Anyway, what's happening is that Yeats is approaching a religious experience, and it's concomitant disbelief. In any notion, poetry alone can handle experience or handle its own activities and its own actions without bad faith. And the question of bad faith is very much in the air here. Responsibility so weighs me down, things said or done long years ago, or things I did not do or say, but thought that I might say or do, weigh me down, and not a day but something is recalled, my conscience or my vanity appalled. Now, going back over what you should have said or what you shouldn't have said, or what you should have done or what you shouldn't have done, and then creating a version of yourself which enables you to forgive yourself for having done the wrong thing. There's obviously something going on here, because as soon as he dispensed the forgiveness to himself, he immediately realizes that's just vanity in order for him to do that, and he remains appalled by the actions of himself. And this is a crux of somebody who is taking from all kinds of belief systems to find a way in which he can somehow justify what it is that he did himself. But of course, all of those belief systems are all going on at a particular time in world history, and this time 1920s, 1930s, in an emergent state, Ireland, which is coming into some kind of a sense of itself, but also with a difficult Europe, which is redefining itself in ways in which it didn't want to define itself, and everybody authenticating themselves with this great illiberal heresy, which is just dominating the entire scene. Whatever the former beliefs were, those former beliefs have been taken away, and what the current beliefs are the things that inform your actions on this earth at this particular point in time. There's a grappling around looking for them again. As he says, in vacillation, his mystical moment, and enabled him to think, it seems so great my happiness that I was blessed and could bless. But it's not the last point, because there's another point that has to follow on from that. It goes back in the opposite direction. The seesaw tips back the other way, and tips back the other way again. So, and you're wondering how you're going to bring this together. So I will quote something from Geoffrey Hill now on this subject, and this again is something which locates this in the position of the 1930s, but also from Hill's point of view, he's writing in the 1970s, looking back to what happened to the post-war liberal order. And that is a refusal to submit to exigencies, things that happen, has itself been seen as the crime of capitalism, imperialism, modern technology, and technological warfare. So there is a sense in which the modern artist is called upon to atone for his own illiberal pride, and a sense in which he's engaged in vicarious expiation for the pride of the culture which itself rejects him. He can't win, but he can't lose either. It is, you might say, the sort of testimonial at which one looks twice. And that's exactly what he's learned from Yeats, is you must always looking twice at whatever position that you take on whatever question of faith that you're thinking about. I'm going to go to the end of the poem, and I'm going to go to the way in which the ending of Vacillation ends up like a sort of the word I'm looking for. I'm going to say a ceasefire, which is about as much as you can have. In fact, I might even use the word ecumenical. In other words, that there's some kind of a movement of calling of a peace between all of these warring beliefs. And one of the ways in which this comes through is in the figure of the Scots-Austrian Catholic theologian Friedrich von Hugel. Von Hugel appears at the very end of Vacillation, and he appears nowhere else in Yeats's poems, and not at all in the prose. When he is mentioned in the letters, in Yeats's letters, we find him in Yeats's letters. He tells his friend T. Sturge Moore, the English artist, that Yeats's doctor had told him to stop reading difficult things. The critic Norman Jeffers tells us that Yeats had been reading von Hugel's book on the mysticism of St. Catherine of Genoa, who, as we have seen, appears alongside Michelangelo in A Vision. The exhumation of the scented body of St. Teresa of Avila is going to appear here. And this was one of Yeats's favourite proofs of sainthood. But although St. Teresa is a different category of saint from St. Catherine, but for Teresa, apparently when her body was exhumed, it still smelt of the perfume. So this was evidence that she was a saint. St. Catherine's embrace of purgatory is one possible reason for von Hugel's appearance. A vacillating wonder about accepting his Catholicism is another thing. And the closer the poem countenances the idea, the less it is minded to accept it. And the syncretism of the Christian saint and of the Pharaoh's mummy is also in here. Homer is my example, and his unchristened heart. And then there is a final farewell to von Hugel. So let me have a look here at this ceasefire, this calling of peace between religions. It's the very last stanza of Vacillation. Must we part, von Hugel, though much alike, for we accept the miracles of saints and honour sanctity. The body of St. Teresa lies undecayed in tomb, bathed in miraculous oil. Sweet odours from it come, healing from its lettered slab. Those self-same hands perchance eternalize the body of a modern saint that once had scooped out Pharaoh's mummy. I, though heart might find relief, did I become a Christian man, and choose for my belief what seems most welcome in the tomb, play a predestined part. Homer is my example, and his unchristened heart. Welcome. The lion and the honeycomb. What has Scripture said? So get you gone, von Hugel. There were blessings on your head. He seems to allow himself briefly to imagine a reckoning, the insight that thinking as opposed to magic might bring him to an end point in which intellect grows sure that all's arranged in one clear view, and thus enabled to embrace the sublimation of death, dismissing all out of intellect and sight. In his last great poem, Man and the Echo, he returns to these ideas. If you know about Man and the Echo, Yeats asked himself a famous question, did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? And that's a famous question, which is a question about whether art can change history. Yeats' play Kathleen de Houlihan had been performed on the Dublin stage, then Irish National Theatre, now the Abbey Theatre, and in that the figure of Kathleen Houlihan, played by his first great love, Maud Gonne, on the stage that night, has suggested that the young men of Ireland go out and shed their blood in order to reincarnate, as it were, the nation. And apparently many men, they were mostly men, women as well, were there that day and were so enthused by this that they went and formed various political groups, and those political groups then became revolutionary groups, and then to the Easter Rising, and then to the Irish War of Independence. Yeats says, I'm responsible for that. But on the second hand, he says, but people died because of something that I did. So that the actual engagement of the artist in history is in itself effects a change for which you then bear responsibility. And is that responsibility, the sending of men to their deaths, really what happened or not? And this is the question which he then asks in The Man in the Echo poem, and again it's the question which seems to be animating Dialogue of Self and Soul, and also in Vacillation. Exactly how is the artist a historical agent? To go back to what I quoted from Seamus Heaney again, whether the word falls into the hands, poetry maybe, each language is the poet's faith and the faith of his fathers, and in order to go his own way in his proper work in an agnostic time, he has to bring that faith to the point of arrogance and triumphalism. So Heaney says, Yeats is a little bit more circumspect than that. And at the very end, I'll finish here at the very, very end, of the Man in the Echo poem, he just simply stares off into the distance. And it goes like there. Up there, some hawk or owl was struck, dropping out of sky or rock. A stricken rabbit was crying out, and its cry distracts my thought. Which then means, wait for the next poem. So you just dramatize it all again. And any position where you might think that the work of art, or the text, or the poem, or whatever it is going to resolve this kind of question for you, it's not. It remains antinomial. All these questions are continuously opposed to each other, but it's the and whatever experiences of being blessed, there's always another poem that's going to come along where you've got to go through the whole thing again. So I'll pause there actually. Okay, so see how you feel about that. Okay, if anybody has any questions. I know I probably went a little bit over the time there.
Has anyone any questions for now, or we could hold them for the end of the next session?
Yes. I've got one, maybe a daft question, but did Yeats have any intention to have anything to do with orthodoxy? Or was he just sort of almost deliberately speculative around all these issues?
Well, there are many orthodoxies.
But did he see?
His background was Church of Ireland. His family were Church of Ireland. His father wasn't much of a Christian, but his mother was. But his early experiences were almost entirely to do with these esoteric societies, the Tarot and the Theosophists and the Order of the Golden Dawn. But the thing is, he never settled in any one of these belief systems. He was always moving in and out of all of them. So what you've got in these later poems is he's back reading theology again. He's reading St. Catherine of Genoa, or in the next day he'll be reading like Homer and Greek. And the idea is to bring these ideas, like the idea of original sin actually as being a Greek invention and not a Christian. All of these things are always coming together. And it's the not settling into any one position. I said syncretic is one word to describe having, taking something from every possible belief system. That is heterodox, I suppose. He will not settle into any kind of orthodoxy, but still all the way through there is somebody who seems to believe But as soon as he wants to have these positions of faith, the skepticism comes back in again and it questions it. So then we reconfigure the question into another question. So it's a, I'm going to say spiritual journey, that sounds like an old cliche or something like that, doesn't it? But there's something going on about that where it's continuously establishing something you think and then having to remake it all up again. Yeah?
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
But going back to my question, so there was almost a sense
No,
in which
no,
he was
no.
saying,
No.
I'm not interested in orthodoxy, I'm
No.
interested in exploration.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah,
Well, this is a practical question, actually. Before you resume,
yeah.
which poems on your sheet would you like us to have read? Because I think it would
I
be useful
think
if you did that.
Okay, yeah, sure. Where are we? This one here. One of the Croagh poems, I'm actually going to read out almost all of these sequences, except for this, maybe not the straying student, but I will read out the entirety of Repentance and the little extracts from the Song of the Books and the Sermon on Swift. Would that be okay? Yeah?
So
I know what you mean,
I was
yeah.
itching halfway through to ask you to stop.
I know.
So that we could read those poems.
I know.
Because we were so behind you.
I'm sorry
I
about
was
that.
so behind
Yeah, I
you.
mean, no, I'm used to lecturing with a screen behind me.
Yes.
But then having said that, whenever I'm in the audience with a screen behind me, I find myself, the person's talking on and I'm reading the thing. I always do try to read it out. But
You don't
yeah.
have to give us value for money, and that's
Okay. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
Okay, of course. Anyway, I'll slow down and read those anyway. It's going to be a different story anyway. This one.
Well,
Yeah. Okay.
We shall break in a moment, but thank you, Matt, so much for that. Two very quick quiz questions. We heard the phrase "surprised by joy."
Yes.
Which Northern Ireland writer named his spiritual journey "Surprised by Joy"? C.S. Lewis, correct. We also heard.
Oxford.
we also heard about a tower stair going upwards. Do we know, historical question now, how can we tell if an ancient spiral tower in a castle is original or false?
The original one would have to be so that the defender could use their right hand.
Exactly so. So it went up that way, so the attacker with their right hand would keep on hitting the middle bit, whereas the defender was free coming down. So if you were attacking a medieval castle up a spiral tower, you send your left-handed soldiers up. There we go. Every day in Oxford Centre for Spiritual Growth is a learning day. I think we shall get back together at about past, if that's okay. About past. So feel free to stretch your legs, wander around, do whatever you wish to do.
Oh, I've got to go.
When